Tell me when to start.
You can introduce yourself.
Hello, привет. I'm Professor William Mallinson, Professor of Political Ideas and Institutions at Università Guilielmos Marconi of Italy. Although I live in Athens and have for many years, I'm a former British diplomat. I became an academic after getting a PhD in international history at the London School of Economics and Political Science. I'm essentially a historian of diplomacy, mainly post-war diplomacy, and an author. I'm mainly known for my books on Cyprus, but my latest book, forthcoming book, Palgrave Macmillan, is called, it's quite an interesting title. It's called wait a minute, let me think of the exact title. It's called, that's a good one, that. Geopolitics, Geohistory. It's called Guicciardini, Geopolitics and Geohistory, Understanding Interstate Relations, to be published by Palgrave Macmillan. Now, I've been asked a series of questions for you. I assume that you're a Russian audience. And I'll just read the first question and give you my thoughts. I'll try to keep them sequential. Now, the first question that my interviewer and expert cameraman asked me was, what is Nazism from my point of view? Well, that's a very good question, because first point is that everybody has a different view of Nazism. The first point is obviously that it is an ideology. The second point is that it has led to fanaticism today. The third point is that it is originally, because you must go to the origin, historians go to the root, it is essentially in name a German manufactured ideology. Let's not forget the words of Leo Tolstoy in the second, I think in one of the epilogues of War and Peace, when he says that the Russians are strong because they don't know anything, and that is their strength, and they know they don't know anything, whereas the Germans invent their theories and think they know it and go to the bitter end, which is evil for humanity, he said. Quite perspicacious and quite perceptive, which goes to show that only history exists even today. Now, to get back to Nazism, NSDAP, National Deutsche Arbeiterpartei, National Deutsche Sozialistische Arbeiterpartei, that is what Nazism is. Since then, it's become something else. Its main thing, and the difference, by the way, with fascism, is that Nazism looks at the nation, people, blood, superiority of the German race. Thank you, Nietzsche. Thank you, Hegel, German philosophers. And thank you, Charles Darwin, also a superiorist, if I may use such a phrase, a word, invent such a word. So, unlike fascism, it goes on the nation and the people, das Volk. Unlike fascism, which goes to the state, fascists do not consider, original Italian fascists, don't forget the Partita Nazionale Fascista was its name, the fascia of ancient Rome, do not go on superiority, on racist superiority, they go on for the state. Both are connected, of course, by totalitarianism, propaganda, history, the Germans with the Valkyrie, ancient Germanic things, Teutonic Knights, the Italians with even Sparta, believe it or not, and the few ruling the many, but also the Roman Empire. So there are differences. Let us not forget that this whole thing German thing was rising in the 20s and 30s. One reason being the very big spread of what they call anti-Semitism, which is not, it's anti-Jewishness, because anti-Semitism means you're anti-Arab, and there are more Arabs than Jews. Don't forget the Arabs are Semites. So anti-Jewishness, in which even people like Winston Churchill were involved. Winston Churchill wrote in a newspaper article about the dangerous Jewish international conspiracy of Bolsheviks. He was obviously influenced by Henry Ford's book, etc., etc. There was a whole movement in the 30s throughout Europe, with Mosley's fascist black shirts in England and the French Croix de Feu, looking at these ideas of racial superiority and control. But it reached its apogee with the Germans and German logic. So that is my sort of quick off-the-cuff, personal, obviously, view, not someone else's view, I hope, of Nazism as juxtaposed with fascism, the German master race. I would say, if you want a comparison, that Nazism is like bad beer and fascism is like bad wine. The fascists of Italy were never slaughtering Jews. In fact, in the war, many Jews were saved, believe it or not, by the fascist state. They went to Italy from Croatia. Modern Nazism, now that's a very interesting question. I'll deal with that a little later, because that's in one of your other questions. Let me make a final comment on Franco. Franco was a phalangist more than a fascist and was closer to the church. Salazar of Portugal actually tried to distance himself from both fascism and Nazism. So we need to distinguish and go to the origins in an academic fashion, instead of using the word fascist for anything we don't like, which is frankly lobotomy, and people who just go by other people's agendas. As Oscar Wilde wrote, we're all somebody else. Our passions are just a joke, and are someone else's passions, and our lives are a mimicry, a copy of other people's lives very often. So it's very difficult to be individual in one's views and even in one's opinions. Now, your next question, very interesting, of course, and something on which I could write 10 books on, but I have to summarize a few, I suppose, sound bites which make sense. And the question is, to what extent is the colonial past of Europe connected with the ideology of the superiority of one nation over another? Oh, very much so. And actually, through geopolitics. If you look at the history of geopolitics, it was beginning at the same time as the scramble for Africa, grabbing Africa. But before that, from the so-called Enlightenment, you had already the notion of the superiority of the white race over the black, brown and yellow races, already from the so-called Enlightenment. And the so-called rationality of Descartes, which really was almost Germanic in its over-exaggerated logic. And this led or helped to so-called justify the grabbing of other people's resources around the world, including what is today the United States of America, blowback today, of course, into Europe. So yes, and has anything altered? Only the colours, because you know we had to give up the empire, as I'll say later on, for many reasons. We, I mean the British, as did the French and most other people. But remember that atavism is the most important element, and atavism isn't even in the dictionaries of so-called international relations. Atavism is what drives the world, in the sense that only history exists. Now, in case you think I'm being a little obtuse or oblique, let me say that if you really want to do a mental striptease, which is difficult, mental nudity with which we're embarrassed, you've got to look at the fact that only the past can exist, only history exists, because everything is always flowing. Ta pandari, as Heraclitus said. If everything's flowing, the present is only our awareness. The present cannot stop. So as I speak, it's the past. The future can only be here. Therefore, only history can exist, and that's atavism, both individual, which becomes corporate. So geopolitics was a justification for getting other people's resources to strengthen your own country, nation, state, whatever you want to call it, because that's another complication. So globalization of geopolitics is what is connected to what I call meta-colonialism and meta-imperialism, the phrases of which are virtually interchangeable. It continues today in one form or another. NATO has its colonies, believe me, everywhere. Its junior members are colonies. I would suggest even that this country, Greece, is a colony of NATO, because they don't dare to come closer to Russia, because they will be crushed, because probably America will say, hey Turkey, grab an island, warn the Greeks, don't be too nice to the Russians with, for example, the Burgos-Alexandroupolis line, which is now dead, or etc., etc. I could go on. Well, to continue, This is history. It's here now in my hand, my grandfathers and my great-grandfathers. You can use it to sit down, so things don't change as much as people would like to claim. Now, I'm going to give you a horrible quote which may frighten you in connection with this atavism and the superiority of one nation over another. Most of us do sometimes feel so strongly within ourselves of who we are that we may consider ourselves, if not better than someone else, at least different. Now, this is what a famous Englishman said, the man who invaded Tibet. He said, our superiority over the Indians isn't just because we're better intellectually, because we have a higher moral nature. Victorian England. And what did a famous liberal say? He said that America was the agent of Anglo-Saxon domination. He predicted a great racial conflict in which the Anglo-Saxons would defeat China, Japan, Africa and South America, where an Italy, Spain, France and Russia would be pygmies by the side of such people. Well, there were big conflicts, weren't there? The Great War and the last war. I leave you with that thought. Now, your next question was most interesting. It's connected to your first question. Can the Third Reich be considered as the heir of the ideas of Nazism, which were widely spread in Europe even before it? Well, I think I've answered that all these racial ideas and anti-Jewish ideas were circulating everywhere in Europe. And because of the dire economic situation, France, Croix de Feu, England, the Moses, black shirts, the Germans, the Italians, Spanish, Civil War, etc., there was this feeling of, that people wanted a dictator, they wanted to follow a leader. But what's important for Nazism is that there are the strong nations that can do what they want, and then there are the slave nations. Now, for the Europeans, these would be Indians, Africans. For Hitler, they might be Jews, Gypsies and Slavs. Of course, don't forget that the Nazis considered the Slavs Untermenschen, which is unbelievable, because I would argue, in fact, that the Nazis were themselves the Untermenschen with an inferiority complex, and that the Slavs were superior. Why not, if you look at history? So in a sense, one could argue that this Nazism, especially when it's globalized, geopolitical Nazism, Haushofer, etc., was a justification for violence and expansion and blood from the soil and expanding. And you still have that today in a nice sort of soft way through economics, which actually means business. I think the word economics can often be a nice euphemism for grabbing resources of other people. Today it's the push of the Germans eastward, taking over companies in the Balkans, taking over big companies, helping Turkey with Turkish business, etc., etc. Now, your next question is it a coincidence that colonial regimes began to crumble like a house of cards immediately after what you call World War II? Well, first let me say for me it's World War IV, because as a historian I see the First World War actually as a 7 Years' War, and the Second World War was the Napoleonic Wars, and then there was the Great War, which becomes the Third World War, and the last war was the Fourth World War, from my view, technically speaking. Anyway, let's talk about the last war. Why did the empire collapse? First, two main reasons. Firstly, economic. Britain had no money and owed a fortune to the United States. Second reason, the United States hated British imperial preference because it kept their businessmen out of the British Empire. Third, the Soviet Union, for ideological reasons, were completely against the idea of empire. So in that sense, we had to give it up. But did we really give it up? No. We gave it to the United States, which kept all the strong points. Diego Garcia, terrible place where they torture people, etc. We gave a lot of it to the United States, and we were forced to open our markets to the United States. The Soviets were happy, reasonably happy, because there was no more British Empire to exploit people. So it was good ideologically, and possibly there was a bit of business sense as well in the Soviets. Let's be reasonable, because they had their markets as well, of course. But it was mainly ideology versus business. Also remember that at the end of the last war, the enemy, Japanese in particular, set up all kinds of independence movements. For example, in Indonesia, they gave money to the person who became the leader who fought against the Dutch colonial masters. So that is another element. And as the Germans left Greece, they supported various people, which helped to lead to the Greek Civil War, although that was caused more by Winston Churchill's love of an unpopular king, but that's another story. So it wasn't so much a coincidence that these colonial regimes begin to crumble. They still carry on in new colours. That's what I'm saying. This is an interesting one. What is more important for war? What is more important for unleashing a war? Ideology or money? Well, rather, let me say that it's both. Atavism comes into it. Once a system, a state, decides it wants a war, it prepares secretly for that war. As, for example, with the bombing of Yugoslavia, which I'll come to later. That was prepared months, even years before. But you've got to remember that in the United States, the military-industrial congressional complex depends on war for continuing to exist and make money for its shareholders. And it embarrasses the United States complex when people refer to President Eisenhower, who warned of the dangers of the military-industrial complex. How embarrassing for them, but people haven't heeded that. So it is surely shareholders' interests that are a major ingredient of big, serious wars and smaller wars, and a feeling of insecurity, because insecurity leads to greed. And I think those are the basic causes of war, along with atavism. And of course, what they call geopolitical interests. But remember that these geopolitical interests, what people call national interests, actually are not the root cause. The root cause are the people themselves, individually, who then become corporate and then find their justification to have interests and grab other people's resources, which is one of the arguments in my latest book. Now, what a question. Why did NATO bomb Yugoslavia? What goals and objectives were pursued? Right, let's remember that at the end of the alleged end of the Cold War in 1989, NATO, the US mainly, had promised, but unfortunately not in a proper diplomatic agreement, had promised Yeltsin and Gorbachev, and then Yeltsin, that NATO would not expand eastwards. But they did. The Warsaw Pact collapsed, but NATO didn't. It's a great shame that they didn't come to a new arrangement then, but NATO said, ha, it's ours, we move east. Because of course Poland atavistically, viscerally loathed Russia. That goes back to the 16th and 17th centuries, of course, atavism. Really, they loathed it. The only thing that kept the whole thing together was an ideology that in the end didn't work properly, or hadn't yet worked, which of course was communism, although the Soviet system itself was quite efficient. So anyway, so why was Yugoslavia bombed? It was bombed to keep NATO going. I've read some very good academic articles by people who were involved in the bombing, and it's quite obvious that NATO, which was due to end in 1999, after 50 years, in fact decided it mustn't end. It took in all these new members, including Poland, and simultaneously bombed Yugoslavia without the permission of the United Nations, a completely illegal bombing, for 78 days. It was also a vicarious war. It was intended to show Russia, the new Russia, that it couldn't go too far. Yet what had Russia done? Russia simply disbanded the whole thing, and there was NATO expanding with this war. So Russia had a red line with Kosovo. It moved its generals down there, and NATO had to stop at that point. It was not about values. That was hypocrisy. It was not humanitarian at all, because they killed nearly 2,000 civilians, so it's a war crime. It is about interests created by NATO, NATO's business machine. Because you must remember, if NATO were disbanded, shareholders in the United States and elsewhere, in large arms companies, would lose millions and millions. They'd only have one yacht instead of 2 yachts each. Dear oh dear, wouldn't that be terrible? That is the fact. So NATO should have died, but they wanted to give it meaning. Part of the process of that, by the way, was how in 1998, on the 23rd of February, this detail is important, Robert Gelbard, who was the United States envoy to the Balkans, described the KLA, UÇK, the Albanian terrorist organization, as without doubt a terrorist organization. Then suddenly he's posted away to the Far East, this professional diplomat, replaced by a banker called Richard Holbrooke, who suddenly turns around, puts his arm around the KLA, and America suddenly recognizes them. They had given Milosevic a blank check to go against these people. But that gave the Americans a reason to say, this isn't good. So they, just like they did in Iraq, that's another story. And then they did the same thing as they did in 1914 with Serbia. They said, we want to put troops on your territory. Unacceptable. They knew it would be unacceptable to Yugoslavia, which tried to make a compromise, and the bombing began. So it was not humanitarian, it was a public relations war to keep NATO going and try to make NATO a world policeman. Now I'm speaking in a detached manner, believe it or not. I have no emotion about this. That is about individual which become corporate interests of money, insecurity leading to fear and grabbing and wanting more and more. Can the bombing of Yugoslavia be considered a war crime? Answer most emphatically, yes. It was not approved by the United Nations, period. It was a NATO operation. It was an illegal NATO operation. They killed over 2,000 innocent civilians and frankly innocent soldiers who hadn't declared war on anybody. Therefore a war crime. And people like Mr. Blair, Mr. Bush, Mr. Cheney, all that bunch of people should be held accountable and should be put on trial as in The Hague. Next question is interesting. How are modern wars waged? Well, the basics are the same. The human animal, the beast, war, the urge to fight, the urge to kill, insecurity, all that. The way that people band up together, and when they're together they feel stronger. There are a lot of alterations, of course. The new technologies, drones, digital warfare is increasingly important. Digital soldiers are increasingly important. New technologies are changing things. Hacking is a vital part of warfare as well. In a nutshell, I will say it's the same wine with new bottles. In what form does Nazism now exist? Which country is the main ideologue of Nazism now? And as I said, original Nazism doesn't exist, but the continuation comes in the symbolism. You will find, for example, one of the main proponents of Nazism are strong groups in the Ukraine. And that goes back to the war. If you go back to the last war, my goodness, a huge number of Ukrainians, not the East Ukrainians, not the true Rus Ukrainians, but a huge number of the others, mainly Polish-connected, Romanian-connected groups, joined with the Nazis. And it continues today. I think the man was called Bandera, with these fanatic groups. So there I would say definitely. Also I would say Croatia. The Croatian Nazis slaughtered, I think, around 700,000 Serbs in the Fourth World War, the last war. They've never really said sorry about that, and they're members of the European Union. So I would say there's a strong tendency, even in modern Croatia, to do that. And let's not forget also the role, I'm afraid, of the Vatican in the whole Balkan Wars. The Vatican was the first state to recognize Croatia prematurely, too early. And that was a dreadful atavistic mistake, because they wanted the Roman Catholic thing from history. And that gave the Germans a chance to recognize them the next day, which led to the Me Too factor and the chaos, which is what NATO was planning anyway. If they'd waited, there may not have been a war. But they couldn't wait. The greed and the NATO public relations machine took over. And I think this has now been widely recognized by non-ideological thinking people, whether they're right or left wing, whatever that means, irrelevant. Do you think that, this is a difficult question for me, do I think that the European Union is pursuing a discriminatory policy towards less developed countries? Well, generally I could argue yes. within the European Union, I would say. I would say that, for example, Germany and France, to a lesser extent, are exploiting the weaker members of the European Union, Greece in particular, Croatia, anywhere where Germany can make big business. That is a form of exploitation. As regards Africa, there have some very unbalanced fishing deals, which I won't go into the details, but if the audience wishes to research that, they'll see that the power of the Union tends to mean that the Union comes out on top with unbalanced agreements. Although I must admit that I'm not an expert on the mechanics of all the agreements that have been made between the European Union and weaker ex-colonial countries. But generally I would say they stay on top where they can, to their own advantage. This is beautiful. Can the Greek economy be considered ruined by the European Union? If so, what methods are used to do this? Let me say that yes, it was ruined by the European Union, but with the help of the corruption in Greece as well. Because I have to say that in some ways the Greek deep state brought it upon themselves, because for better or for worse, looked at negatively, some people would say Greece is still a very Balkan country with a European overcoat that shines very much. But when you look at the huge corruption of the members of parliament who have so much more money than anybody else, far more even than in England, compared to the rest of the population. When you look at the payments under the table that went on, Greece was eminently exploitable by this dreadful European system. The biggest mistake that they ever made was to join the euro prematurely. Because actually I'm a bit of a European myself, but it needs to be controlled and reformed. That's the problem. But they joined this euro too early with fake statistics from Goldman Sachs, and that also contributed to the exploitation and the destruction of their economy, where they have to go on paying, I think, for another 45 years or something. It's surrealistic. When you look now at how many Greeks have left the country, it's an embarrassment. How many young people have left the country? It's an embarrassment. It's a great embarrassment. And now with this so-called virus and the thought control and the fear being manufactured and people dying from the measures, it's even worse for Greece. So one hopes that in the long run they'll get out of it through a bit of independence, but they don't want to be independent at the moment. Now, here's your final question, and I'm going to give a little quote here. What can I say about United States plans to attack the USSR? I think you mean Russia today, of course. And you mentioned the drop shot plan. This is a well-known plan for war against the Soviet Union, which today, of course, is Russia. People can't separate the idea of Russia, of communism, of the Soviet Union, not being able to distinguish in their robotic agendaed minds, of course. Could the United States attack Russia in the same way that they attacked Yugoslavia if Russia did not have a nuclear bomb? I do not wish to justify nuclear weapons, but I'm afraid that if Russia did not have a nuclear bomb, I think it would have been threatened with a nuclear bomb and would have had to give way. But it hasn't had to, because it's probably got a better nuclear arsenal than the United States. But I can also say that hypotheses do not exist. They're merely a thought creator. So I can't say definitely what would have happened, because it didn't happen. Most countries have war plans. I have no doubt that Moscow has a very good war plan to annihilate parts of the United States system, just as the United States has, just even as England has and France have. England may even still have a plan which to attack Russia, to attack France, although it would be covered in dust in a cupboard, but it'll be there. That's what armies are for. They're called, euphemistically speaking, contingency plans. Now then, let me quote, it's not for long, but it's from my book, and it's this, and it's crucial because it's fundamental to what's happening, because we often don't realize what is happening until it's happened. The globalization of geopolitics has led to the weakening of the state and the strengthening of fragmentation and of national emotion. nationalism in the seductive name of a world without borders. It's a big trick. I'm not saying it's a planned trick, but it's what's happening. It is well known that good fences make good neighbors, but that doesn't seem to be the case. They're breaking down traditional diplomacy. Business is controlling more than it used to. It used to have a better balance of state and business interests, but now it seems sometimes that it's the business that decides the interests and not the state. So in that sense, state interests, don't call them national interests, that's a euphemism for state the way it's used, and the nation state doesn't exist. It's an oxymoron, a utopian dream. So you get my meaning. So I've written, as for the Steppenwolfish relationship between the state and nation and the idealistic assumption that the confusing concept of the nation state is viable, ne'er the twain shall meet. Better to base, I think, everything on the unemotional and dispassionate and detached state as the only arbiter, the only referee between the diverse groups that inhabit it with equal rights for everybody, without the need to alienate group from group through the exploitation of identity politics, over-categorization and nationalism. The state, currently under threat, remains the only guarantee against the chaos that we have in a currently increasingly confused world of emotional, political and ideological isms. So I'll finish with my opposition to identity politics. We now have apparently more than, in some American universities, more than 26 genders, which takes away the idea of man and woman and family. A cynic would say that they're trying to make every single individual have his or her own gender, except you can't say his or her anymore. It's an embarrassment. But by trying to force people to be members of a group, they create stress between groups. And it's easy to say divide and rule. Now, it's not a group of billionaires meeting and saying, let's control the millionaire sheep to control the world. No, but it's what's happening willy-nilly. And that's the paradox. And we need to get back to slowing down through experience and better seeing that things and technology are moving too fast, and that if technology controls us, we just become a joke. But we're not yet a joke. I think that's the end, unless you have any more questions. But there's never an end, is there?
Okay, no.
And then presumably from their point of view, we then left here and we went up to Philopapu, and I continued with my blazer. That's right, yeah.
The first question was, what is Nazism?
What is Nazism? Right, tell me when to start and I'll try and get going again. Yeah. What is Nazism? Well, Nazism is essentially German. I think that's the first thing we need to remember, which many people forget, who overuse the word now for anything. It's actually the Nationalsozialistische Deutsche Arbeiterpartei. It's particularly German. It's based on racism mainly, and superiority of the German race. You look at some German philosophers like Nietzsche, Hegel, and you see it all. And but it also grew out of a general feeling at the time in Europe where racism was actually quite important. You look at and totalitarianism important. You take a look at France in the 30s, for example, les croix de feu, the crosses of fire. You take a look at England, the Mosley, the black shirts. Winston Churchill himself, who described the Jews as a Bolshevik, worldwide Bolshevik conspiracy in a newspaper article. Then he was told to shut up, but he was very like that. The whole world, in fact, but Europe in particular, was influenced by this anti-Jewish movements that existed everywhere, and all connected to finance, of course, and the famous book by Henry Ford, which affected a lot of minds, negatively, of course. When people, by the way, use the word anti-Semitic, that's highly inaccurate, because the largest group of Semites are actually the Arabs. So to be anti-Semitic is also to be anti-Arab and anti-Syriac, as well as anti-Jewish. So I think we should be specific, and we're talking about anti-Jewish. Now, of course, the German race was not only superior to the Jews, they considered also the Slavs, Untermenschen, lower people, etc. It's quite interesting to compare sometimes Nazism to fascism. Now, and they're different. I mean, I look on Nazism as a kind of bad beer and fascism as a kind of bad wine. It is quite significant that during the last war, many Jewish people were actually saved by the Italians from Croatia and went to Italy. So the Italian form of totalitarianism was not based on race. It was based on the state being above everything. Whereas Nazism, the German version, was based essentially on the nation, the people, the blood, the expansion. If you look at Salazar, another sort of, totalitarian man, he actually distanced himself from both Nazism and fascism. So, I could go on here. People have written hundreds of books about the things I'm talking about, but we need to be as specific as we can. Now, it was not just, of course, as I said, the Germans. We take a look at people that the Nazis loved, like Darwin, with his interesting and speculative theory of evolution. They loved it because it was survival of the fittest, and the fittest will win, the fittest are strong. So they loved him. And at this time, of course, geopolitics was coming into fashion. The term geopolitics was being used. The German Haushofer, the English Mackinder. I'll go on about that a bit later, if you like. So that is what it is for the time being. But another question arises as to whether Nazism has come back. Well, as I will quote now Guicciardini, for example, who said that things have always been the same, the past sheds light on the future, and that the same things return with different colours. Now, you take a look at today, there are undoubtedly totalitarian tendencies. The sad thing is that people use the word fascist for anything they don't like, or Nazi. This, of course, is childish and betrays a lack of deep thought in those who swallow any slogan. Because now, to be slightly, you'll forgive me for being that, perhaps intellectual or thoughtful, and bearing in mind that the speed of technology has taken away people's space to think. So, instead of opinions, they have opinions with their smartphones. But it's this, because there's not so much space now to reflect, to seriously reflect, because there's not space not to think, in order to think, it is very difficult to even understand what is happening until it has happened. To some extent, that is what happened with Nazism. When it happened, it was too late already. And that's why we have to be careful nowadays. We take a look at for example, Nazi tendencies in the Ukraine and in Croatia, where they massacred and slaughtered 700,000 Christian Orthodox Serbs. And these are Roman Catholic fanatics killing Serbs. So the same things come back. Such questions haven't been resolved even today, and they continue. They continue. Now, another question which you asked.
Look to me, please.
Yes, another question which you asked me, and there's a lot more to say about this, about the European Union of currencies, which is exactly what the Nazis wanted, etc., control of Europe. So one can argue that there are economic connections, especially now with Mr. Schwab and the so-called Great Reset. I consider these people are slightly megalomaniac, in fact, and love controlling. It's quite dangerous. Anyhow, the next question which you've asked is, to what extent is the colonial past of Europe connected with the ideology of the superiority of one nation to another? Yes, one nation to another, one blood group to another. Well, I think we've gone over some of that just now, with the superiority of the German race. Let me mention Tolstoy, who I think explained that phenomenon fairly well as to why perhaps it was later to hit Germany so badly, when he said that whereas the Russians don't know that they don't know, the Germans invent their theory but then believe their theory to the bitter end, because they have no flexibility, and that is quite dangerous. Now, to get back to the main question, we must remember that atavism always exists. Atavism is the history of people's characteristics. And those characteristics do not go away just because we've got smartphones and we can make bombs to blow up buildings without kill people without damaging the building, etc. Because our technology is so sophisticated, atavism is always there, under the surface. Connected to that is the corporate atavism, as well as individual atavism. We all have our history, we all know who we are. We're from our parents. We don't have to have an identity crisis. Yet at the same time, we are now being told by so many universities and governments, you've got to have an identity. You've got to be LGBTQT, XYZ, who knows, there are 26 genders, or you've got to be black, or you've got to be white, or you've got to be this or that. And that is actually dividing society. Why? Well, if society is divided into groups, those groups become suspicious of each other, and it's therefore easier to control those groups. Now that's a paradox of globalization, because globalization claims to break down borders and make us all happy and rich and all the rest of it, when in fact it's causing the opposite. It is weakening the nation state and creating strife and war, all in at the same time as these globalizers try to control the markets. So it's a paradox. It's having the opposite effect, and it's quite dangerous. It's quite dangerous. It's happening now. And this is where it connects to geopolitics, because we have again to go back to history. Let me interrupt myself now and give you, what you might call a mental underpinning for my own view of what history really is. I argue that history, in its purest form, is the past. And I argue that only history can actually exist. Why? Because everything is always moving and flowing. And therefore, what we call the present is simply our current awareness of history, of what's just happened now as I speak. As for the future, it cannot exist except here. We are memories on two legs. To think like this so basically is a kind of intellectual nudity. We don't like walking around with no clothes on, but only the greatest writers and poets can express themselves in a nude fashion, in a simple fashion. We avoid simplicity, we fear simplicity, we seek extra roads around simplicity because we do not want to expose our ideas too much. But that's what one can argue. Only the past exists, and the past is history. Let me quote now, because it's relevant to today, and this is a very small amount of reading, what a famous British general wrote about 100 years ago, little more. He's the man who invaded Tibet. He said that our superiority over the Indians is not just because we are more intelligent, but it's our higher moral nature. And remember, this wasn't a German, this was an Englishman. And then a so-called liberal member of parliament at the same time, Sir Charles Dilke, considered America as the agent of Anglo-Saxon domination. He predicted a great racial conflict from which Saxondom, the Saxons, would rise triumphant, with India, China, Japan, South America being defeated, and the Italy, Spain, France and Russia would be pygmies by the side of the Saxons. That's why he didn't mention Germany, because there was then this sense of atavistic brotherhood between the most English of the English, and I don't mean the Celts and the Jews of England, I mean those who considered themselves descended from the Germanic barbarians that invaded England after the Romans, who connected to the developing ideas of Nazism, which of course developed well before Adolf Hitler. So that's something to be noted. Now, I think the last question, for the time being, the third question was, can the Third Reich be considered as the heir of the ideas of Nazism, which were widely spread in Europe even before it? Well, look, my question there, and I'll be slightly repetitive, is that only one main thing is important for Nazism, internationally speaking, and that is that nations, or that states and nations, particularly for the Nazis, that are allowed to do anything are the masters, the master races. And then you have the minor nations who are the slaves. For the Europeans, the slaves were Indians, Africans. For Hitler, they were Jews, Gypsies, and Slavs. So there are connections. In that sense, one could use Nazism to justify morally robbery and violence. And look at today. Look at Bush Jr. saying the Americans are exceptional. It's the same thing. Look at the crusade. Look at the war in Iraq. Look at Afghanistan. We are superior. We are better. We are going on a crusade. It's the same things coming back with different colors. It's not so much that history repeats itself. It's that the same things are always there, but they just get hidden. And new names come up. New colors. That's what happens. Everything is based really on the human characteristic. Now, the behavior stemming from those unchangeable characteristics, the behavior is unpredictable. We can never know exactly how a human being will react. We only know that they have basic characteristics. I could go on and on. Ask some questions, stimulate me. There's so much, there's so much to say.